Hi, Truth of the Matter listeners. I'm Naveen Girishankar, president of the CSIS Economic Security and Technology Department and the host of CSIS's newest podcast, Betting on America, where we explore the global technology race and what it'll take for the United States to come out on top. Join me as I sit down with leaders from business and government to understand the risks and the rewards of investing in the technologies and industries of the future in a community near you. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts to learn how and why we are betting on America.
I'm Andrew Schwartz, and you're listening to The Truth of the Matter, a podcast by CSIS where we break down the top policy issues of the day and talk with the people that can help us best understand what's really going on.
To get to the truth of the matter about the Trump administration's policy in the Middle East, including what's going on with the Houthis right now, and we're talking on March 18th at around noon East Coast time, I have with us Mr. Norman T. Roule, who is a great friend of the podcast. He is a non-resident senior advisor to CSIS on warfare, irregular threats in our terrorism program. More to the point, Norm served for 34 years in the Central Intelligence Agency, managing significant programs relating to the Middle East. So I don't know anybody who knows more about this stuff than Norm, and that's why I asked you to come on today. Welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Thank you, Andrew. You're very kind in your opening.
All right, Norm, what the heck is going on with the Houthis? You know, we've talked on this podcast before about how, the Houthis were pretty much attacking at will in the Red Sea, including U.S. assets. That seems to have come to an end with some pretty strong action from the Trump administration. What's the status of where we are right now?
So first, some background. The Houthis have been empowered by Iran with more than a dozen missile systems, some of which they've adapted to Houthi-style systems, more than 10 drone systems to include seaborne drones, which they've used effectively. They have attacked American vessels 175 times. They have attacked commercial shipping more than 140 times.
Wait a second, I got to stop you there for a minute, Norm. They have attacked U.S. naval forces 175 times?
Yes, according to a statement made by U.S. officials over the previous weekend.
Unbelievable. Okay, please continue, sir.
And they've attacked commercial shipping more than 140 times. They have sunk vessels. They have damaged vessels. They have killed Vietnamese. They have killed Filipino commercial seafarers. They have wounded seafarers. They have come close to causing unprecedented in naval history ecological damage with shipping. They have likely damaged communications cables that have threatened significant communications between Asia and Europe. Okay. That's over many, many months. So what has the world done about it? An ad hoc coalition was put together, Operation Prosperity Guardian, primarily dominated by the United States. We've sent several aircraft carrier task forces to the region. So that's an aircraft carrier with a number of missile ships, ancillary ships, about 7,000 plus personnel each who respond to these attacks. We have had our British colleagues who have done a lot of great work both with their ships and with their aircraft. And we've had vessels from some NATO partners as well who have participated. What the Biden administration did in response to these attacks was a very effective job in defending the shipping from attacks, degrading Houthi forces by attacking missiles on the ground and some of the drone sites and boat launch sites, but they did not deter the Houthis from conducting additional strikes. And I list the numbers of strikes as evidence. It was a policy that did not achieve a strategic goal. Now, that's not a criticism of the men and women who were out there who, to put a very fine point on it, we had thousands of Americans risk their lives on a daily basis to restore freedom of navigation in a critical waterway that handles a large percentage of world trade, that Iran would very much like to control because it could control the Bab el-Mandab, would control the Strait of Hormuz. It would therefore control the Suez Canal. It would give it influence over not only the Red Sea basin economies, that's Egypt, that's Jordan, that's Israel, that's Sudan. It gives it the ability to touch the west coast of the Arabian Peninsula, but also allows it to touch European countries and through that, the American economy. This is a significant power projection by the Iranians. And this is something we've never had in history before. But we did not stop Iran from executing that. And as of this point, there have not been LNG shipments for many months through the Red Sea. Maersk and other shippers have not used the shipping for quite a while. And some have said that primarily Russian and Chinese ships are the only commercial shippers to really use the Red Sea. That's an overstatement, but it's not entirely untrue. And it's quite a thing to say that we're risking American lives to protect Russian and Chinese shipping.
That is really quite a thing to say. I want to ask you about the deterrence piece. Biden administration tried, did not deter, as you said and indicated, with these numbers, 175 attacks on U.S. vessels alone, not to mention the commercial ships. The Houthi minister, Jamal Amer, spoke to Reuters late Monday and said that the Houthis will not dial down their action against Israeli shipping in the Red Sea in response to U.S. military pressure or appeals from the group's allies, such as Iran. According to Reuters, Iranian sources say Tehran told the Houthis to cool the tensions. Houthis say they don't dictate to us. Where does this leave the Houthis, and what about our continuing strategy in this space?
Okay, so let's talk about Iran's control over the Houthis. As we've talked about before, Iran is a serial arsonist that, in essence, propagates other arsonists in other neighborhoods. And then once it has empowered these arsonists in these other neighborhoods, it just lets them do the voodoo that they do so well. And then it achieves Iranian goals, their goals. Iran is able to say it had nothing to do with it. But that's not entirely true. Iran has provided the Houthis with weapons, with training, with funds, with intelligence. There are Quds Force personnel that have been, according to public reports, operating in Yemen. There are Lebanese Hezbollah personnel on air defense and rocketry who have operated in Yemen, according to public reports, and even Iraqi Hezbollah personnel who have operated there with Iranian guidance. So Iran has enabled the Houthis to do all of this to achieve Iran's goals. Now, are the Houthis doing this only because Iran is telling them? No. Could the Houthis do this without Iran telling them? Only to a much, much smaller degree. So let's carry this into what the Trump administration is doing, because it gets to the point of what the Houthis are saying. Would they continue to fire if the Iranians told them no, if the U.S. told them no? Well, it depends. First of all, it depends if we leave them alive. Simple as that. It depends how we take this campaign.
Well, and it certainly seems that the Trump administration is adopting a very muscular posture towards them and doing what needs to be done.
What the Trump administration is doing is they're following a very traditional escalatory ladder that the Biden administration used in Iraq against Iraqi militias that killed American service personnel in Jordan, and that the Trump administration used in Iraq against Qasem Soleimani. That ladder begins with public and private statements saying, don't do this. It then involves moving ships to the region, saying, look what we can do. It involves striking facilities, saying, we have the capability, don't make us do this. You then come closer. And then finally, you move up the chain of command until finally you hit enough senior people to say, look, do we really have to take everyone out before you people stop? In the case of Qasem Soleimani, the answer was no. In the case of the two Kataib Hezbollah personnel responsible for attacks on our personnel in Jordan, the answer was Kataib Hezbollah got the message earlier. The Trump administration is now following this traditional escalatory pattern, and this is an appropriate policy. The question becomes, what should be done against Iranian personnel in Yemen? And this becomes a significant issue because even in the Biden administration, they would say Iran enabled. People should look at the CENTCOM and the Biden administration statements, but nothing was done against Iran. Now, you will have people say Iran should pay a price for their actions. That's a very easy thing to say.
What does that actually mean?
It means nothing. It means you could conduct a sanction against someone who has no financial exposure in the West, rub your hands and say, I'm done. You could issue a tweet. You could issue a diplomatic démarche. Let's pull this out a little differently. Should we target for lethal action Quds Force personnel who are standing next to Houthi missiles in Yemen? How about Quds Force personnel standing next to lethal boats that are about to be launched against U.S. ships? How about the intelligence ships that the Iranians are reported to be using to guide Houthi targeting of vessels against civilian craft in the region? Should they be attacked? Should we kill their sailors? Should we take their sailors hostage? These are huge questions, and they deserve some discussion and some serious debate by the appropriate officials, not necessarily in too much public debate by the internet crazies, but by serious people. But we need to avoid the simple statement of course, Iran should pay a price, because that's thin tea.
And President Trump, of course, says that Iran will suffer dire consequences for any more Houthi attacks. And yet the Houthis are saying, well, we're not listening to Iran. So how do you unpack all of that?
Well, Iran, again, does provide the Houthis with money, people, and stuff. The Houthis need that money, people, and stuff to achieve many of their strategic aims. Would they fight without the Iranian assistance? Absolutely. Would they be able to continue fighting against other Yemeni factions? Absolutely. But again, that's not necessarily an American problem. And Secretary of Defense Hegseth stated, we're not attempting to get involved in Yemeni internal issues. What we're trying to do is to stop the threat to civilian shipping in a critical artery of international commerce. We're the only country that can bring this firepower to the Red Sea, because we're the only country with a navy that has this capacity that can do so. The Europeans don't have sufficient naval assets with anti-ship, anti-missile capacity. Hence, what they bring, although valiant and they have played their role, isn't sufficient to do what we're doing. And they also, collectively as Europe, lack the political will to take some of these hard steps. If anyone wishes to test me, you may look to Google European statements on the U.S. actions in Yemen. Europe has been rather quiet as to what the U.S. is doing. But simultaneously, you may wish to Google who benefits the most from Red Sea trade, and you will get Egypt, Jordan, Israel, Europe. And the idea that America is doing so much to support European trade and not getting perhaps a little more recognition, I think is a burr under some saddles in Washington.
That's a really interesting point because, the narrative lately, of course, has been that the United States' aggressive trade policies are not good for Europe, but yet we're trying to protect Europe's shipping lanes.
This is true. And in fact, the Red Sea work by the Houthis has had inflationary pressures in Spain, Greece, Portugal, Italy, France, Belgium. I mean, a variety of countries, because of the way a whole bunch of different trade, to include LNG from Qatar, has had to shift around Africa. And whatever one's views on the role of the United States, just looking at the map, you will note very quickly the Red Sea is not next to New York or Los Angeles.
No, it's not.
Now, this said, because of what this means for the greater demand on shipping, it actually increases the cost of shipping from Shanghai to Los Angeles. And the Red Sea is not in the middle of that either. It actually increases the demand for containers that normally would be available if the Red Sea would be in use. So we do pay more in the United States, which we're able to absorb in our economy because of the inflationary impact of the Red Sea. But this is something that does benefit Europe, and the United States is showing its commitment to international collective security.
Norm, so can you describe what kind of options now do the Houthis have if the United States is saying and doing really muscular things to them? Is it possible to actually end their reign of terror there with what we're doing now? And then I guess, another question is, you mentioned we have 7,000 personnel right there now. How much danger are they in?
Well, knock on wood, our personnel are highly protected by extraordinary equipment, by exceptional training, and by magnificent leadership. And the last many months have shown that has occurred many, many times. We're watching our investment over many years in people and equipment and leadership really play out in the Red Sea. And our adversaries around the world are also watching how effectively the United States is handling this assignment. For the Houthis, they have some significant challenges. Clearly, we have eyes on the prize. We have likely geospatial, probably ISR, air breathing eyes, looking for any missile that shows itself, drone activity. explosive boat activity, and then we kill it before it takes off. At the same time, according to press reports, some senior Houthi officials are no longer with us, and that implies intelligence on the location of Houthi officials. So these officials are now likely talking amongst themselves, saying, if they knew about this individual who's no longer with us, do they know about us? So if we make this next move against the Americans, which one of us may not be here tomorrow? That's appropriate. That's the conversation you want to provoke in the Houthi leadership, to have them say, maybe we don't want to do that because neither of us may be here tomorrow because the Americans may know where both of us are located. This is why this escalatory ladder that the Trump administration is pursuing is appropriate. However, we have the Iranian long-term ambition. So as you look at something like the nuclear deal, and I don't want to get too far from this issue, the Trump administration withdrew from the nuclear deal in 2018 because it stated that the nuclear deal, in part, provided funding for Iran to fund militias throughout the region and provide them with the very missiles and drones that the Houthis have used so effectively to shut down international commerce. So you don't want to provide a nuclear deal, a new nuclear deal, that in essence repeats all of that. And that means the Quds Force cannot be tolerated to continue to operate in Yemen simply to rebuild whatever we turn off today. And the reason for that is if the Houthis were to say today, we're going to stop what we're doing because of what's happening in Israel this week, I want you to imagine a hypothetical scenario of next week someone in Sweden burns a Quran and the Houthis say, we're going to stop all shipping related to Sweden or anyone who supports Sweden. Would you be surprised? What do we have to do then? So we, in essence, have to end this Iranian threat to international shipping because the Bab el-Mandab is so critical to the globe's economy. And if we don't do it in the Bab el-Mandab, will we do it in the Malacca Straits? Will we do it in the Panama Canal? This is important to the artery of global commerce.
And do we have the capability of fighting in all these places at the same time right now?
Well, we're not fighting in all of these places at the same time, but
if we had to.
I'm not a military expert, but I would say that the two aircraft carrier task forces with the air assets that accompany them and a submarine with sufficient Tomahawks have sufficient technological power in 2025 to destroy the military of any medium-sized country on the planet. The Houthis should not be a problem in that regard. Now, there is the issue of we have a limited number of missiles. Do we want to expend those there? Do we want to provide those to the Ukrainians? Do we want to use those for stockpile for other conflicts? How much of these assets do we want to expose to our adversaries? Because Russians and Chinese are watching us use these assets in action and say, this is how they perform. We need to adapt our own weapons to deal with these capabilities. So I am confident that there is nothing in the Middle East that the United States military could not deal with. I'll leave the rest of the world to people who handle that.
Norm, you mentioned Gaza. Of course, that's part of this equation. Gaza was attacked last night by Israel. Hostages are still not back, despite warnings from the United States, despite warnings from Israel. Is our policy working towards Hamas? Is this part of it? And what do you think the outcome could be?
This is a very difficult and even emotional issue where people can have a variety of different positions. Where you stand is where you sit. I confess I feel a little reluctant to speak on some of this because the families of hostages, the families of soldiers who are fighting in, who have lost their lives in Gaza, the families of Palestinians who have died in this conflict have legitimate positions on this that I shouldn't be seen as questioning. But the Trump administration has done several things clearly. They've said, we're going to give Israel what it needs to defend itself. That's appropriate. They have said to the Palestinians, we will negotiate with you. We will seek an extension of the truce to provide you with peace. We want the American hostages back and other hostages back. That is appropriate. We have told Hamas, we are not going to play games and we will support the eradication of your group because you are a terrorist organization if you don't cooperate. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and our policy for many years has been that we support the eradication of terrorist groups. That's appropriate. We have also, the president has been quite vocal in saying all hell will break loose if the Palestinians don't cooperate. And frankly, the president has extended his timelines to allow his negotiators to meet directly with Hamas officials, according to press reports. And that is also going beyond what I think some people would have predicted initially. So the United States has shown some considerable flexibility here. What will this achieve? Unfortunately, civilian casualties. I fear it might hurt hostages. It will certainly eradicate terrorists, and that's a good thing. It will not bring peace to Gaza soon, and that's not a good thing. And it will delay hostage negotiations. But we're in a weird chemistry where unless you have access to really good intelligence, really good understanding of what's happening within leadership circles of hostage holders and the Hamas leadership, you're just giving an opinion of what you think Hamas leadership is thinking about its decision making. Over the decades, as people think about how a group handles itself while under wartime pressure, that's a really difficult thing to assess. But the Trump administration has been clear, it has been consistent, it has been flexible, and it has appropriately put American lives forward. I should also note that the FBI has initiated a focus on supporters of Hamas and looking for ways to reduce funding to a terrorist group, which has always been declared a terrorist group since 1997. And to be very clear, killed 40 Americans in the greatest terrorist action against Americans since 9/11 and took American hostages is a good thing as well.
Norm, this might be a really overly simplistic question, but I have to ask you, in the case of both the Houthis and in the case of Hamas, aren't they scared? The United States has a lot of firepower there. Israel has a lot of firepower there. Aren't they scared for their existence?
The definition of they.
I mean, the Houthis and Hamas.
I'm with you, but I don't want to get too analytic and too academic, but individually, sure. As a group, you haven't seen Hamas surrender or the Houthis surrender as a group. Iran will fight to the last proxy. Iran shows tremendous caution in putting its own people on the line. We saw this when it was losing senior officers in the Syrian campaign in 2013 and 2014 as the number of funerals in Iran increased. The Iranian pressure to find someone else to fight the Syrian war increased. Iran does not have a lot of courage in putting its own people on the line in these conflicts, but Iran does have a way of pushing others into those front lines. There is a self-generating capacity to the propagandas of these groups. I think that's a difficult question to answer in that regard, but the individual leaders of these groups have very good reason to think that the intelligence capacity of their primary adversary, Israel, and increasingly the United States, as we've seen with the Houthis, is exceptional within the last year, and that their life expectancy is likely a lot less than they anticipated a couple of years ago.
Norm, as always, thank you very much for this invaluable perspective on what's happening and what the Trump policy has been to try to address these challenges.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And if I can close by saying you run a very useful podcast. It's perhaps with the exception of today, it's routinely insightful and something I listen to. And I encourage your listeners to do what they can to spend time trying to hear what voices in the region think about this. And the Center for Strategic and International Studies, through John Alterman and other people, Seth Jones and others, Emily and others, do a great job in bringing that forward. So thank you very much for what you do.
Norm, that means a lot coming from you. Thanks again.
If you enjoyed this podcast, check out our larger suite of CSIS podcasts. From Into Africa, The Asia Chessboard, China Power, AIDS 2020, The Trade Guys, Smart Women, Smart Power, and more. You can listen to them all on major streaming platforms like iTunes and Spotify. Visit csis.org/podcasts to see our full catalog.